Hello, my name is Sarami and today we're making the Hazelton wrap dress for Cashmerette. With a classic collar and fold back button cuffs, timeless elegance meets modern comfort in the Hazelton wrap dress. This iconic silhouette with its full skirt and waist tie has a lined bodice, but the real feature is the no-gape neckline, and the Hazelton wrap dress is made for cup sizes in C to H. The Hazelton wrap dress is part of the Cashmerette Club membership program. You can learn more about Cashmerette Club by checking the link in the description. The Hazelton wrap dress is a knit dress, and we're going to be using a little bit of clear elastic and some fun sewing techniques to make this beautiful dress. Are you ready to get to it? Let's sew. For my fabric today, I'm using a cotton lycra and it has a 50% stretch going both directions, so a little bit more than what's called for in the pattern. And my lining today is a similar fabric to what you'd use for lining a swimsuit. This is a very lightweight knit and has lots of stretch. For the notions, we're going to need some clear elastic and some buttons for the cuff. As for the sewing, we're using 3/8" seams throughout, and I'll let you know if that's different along the way. And we're going to be using a zigzag stitch to assemble the dress, and that zigzag stitch will be 0.5 wide by 2.5 long. And I'll let you know when that needs to change for certain steps. But that'll give us enough stretch and it'll look a little bit like this, so barely a zigzag. I'm using a stretch needle, but you also might find a jersey needle works with your fabric better. For the seam finish today, I'm going to be using a serger or an overlock and probably a cover stitch for the hems, but I'll remind you along the way when to finish your seams. For all my notches, I've cut out the little triangle so it's more visible on camera, but for your project, I just recommend snipping into the fabric like 1/8 of an inch, just a tiny little bit, like 3 millimeters. And just to give you an indication of where you're lining things up to. This is just for visibility's sake. For our first step, we're going to interface both of our collars and both of our cuffs. For most of our seams today, we're going to be using a 3/8" seam, and we're going to stitch them and then we'll finish the edges. But if you want to assemble your dress using a serger or an overlock, you can do your seams and your finishing all in one step using your serger. Our first step is sewing our darts on the back. We're going to do this on both of our lining and our outer fabric, which is also called the shell in the instructions. Once our darts are sewn, we're going to press them towards the center. And now we're going to repeat this for our lining. All right, we're going to sew the shoulder seams for our fronts to our backs, and we're going to sew the shoulder seams for the outer fabrics and the lining fabrics. We'll also need our clear elastic for this step. So we're going to put our fronts face up and our back right sides together so that the wrong side of the back is facing up. And we're going to place our elastic on this seam here. And we're going to just sew straight through it. We're not going to stretch it. We're just going to lay it down and sew it to the seam here. We're going to use a 3/8" or 1 centimeter seam allowance. And we'll repeat this for our other outer shell shoulder seam. We're not going to add elastic to the lining. We'll just sew the shoulder seams on the lining. Now I'll sew my shoulder seams of my lining. Once all your shoulder seams are sewn, we're going to press your lining shoulder seams towards the front and your shell or outer bodice, we're going to press those shoulder seams towards the back. Now it's time to assemble our collar. We're going to place our collar right sides together. We're going to sew our collar together along the 2 short edges and along the longer straight edge. The curved edge goes against the neck and we're going to wait to sew that later. And we're using a 3/8 inch seam or 1 centimeter. Let's trim our seam allowances down in half. I'm going to clip the corners a little bit. And now we're going to turn this right side out and press. Our collar is now ready to attach to the bodice. We're going to place our collar onto our outer bodice now, and we're going to line up our collar from this notch here along the front neck around the back. We're going to line up our notches. I put a little notch here at the center back. We have this notch on the collar goes to the shoulder, and we're pressing those outer shell shoulder seams towards the back. And then our collar front lines up to this notch along the neckline here. We're going to baste these layers together using a 1/4 inch or 6 millimeter seam. Now we'll add our lining to the neckline, and our shoulder seams on the lining are pressed forward so that we're offsetting the thickness here at the shoulders. So we'll line it up to the same notches that we did before on the collar. And we're going to go all the way down to the front edge here, right here at this juncture. And when we go to sew it, we're not going to sew this little short edge quite yet. So we're just going to line it up here at the center front, all along this edge here. And we're going to use our elastic again so that we can stabilize this edge. I would like a label in my back neck here, so I'm going to place one down. I'm going to place the wrong side of my label to the right side of my lining. So basically I'm putting my label right sides together to the shell at the center back neck here. Now we're going to baste the lining to the shell. We're going to use our full seam allowance. So we're using our full 3/8 seam allowance, and we're starting at this point right here at the neckline here. All right, now we're going to add our elastic to the lining side and the same seam. We're going to change our stitch width to be 2.5, and we're going to change our length to 3. 2.5 width, 3 length. We're going to stitch this right inside the seam allowance, and we're going to apply a tiny bit of tension to the elastic as we sew along here all the way around the perimeter. So I'm just barely going to tug. And I'm going to line up my elastic edge to the seam. That way it'll turn to the inside nicely. We're almost done with the neckline. Now we're going to understitch the lining. So we're going to open up the seam and we're going to hold it a little bit taut so we don't get any of this lining kind of blumping over onto the shell. And we're going to stitch all of this seam allowance to the lining. So we're going to sew on the lining side and we're going to use that same stitch that we just did on the elastic. So we're going to stick to the 2.5 width and the 3 length. All right, it's looking really good. Now we're going to press our bodice. So we're going to roll that lining to the inside and we're going to line up all these edges around the perimeter. We're going to baste these layers together along the side seams and the armhole here. And you're going to leave your waist edge free as well as your center front edge here. You're going to leave those unbasted. It's really starting to take shape now. It looks really cute. So now we're going to attach our sleeves and we're going to have a bodice soon. We have our sleeves here and we're going to match our top notch here to the shoulder seam, our double notches to the back, and our single notch to the front. Just like this, we're going to match our notches up. I'm going to use the serger or an overlock to sew my seam. We're going to sew this seam at your original zigzag stitch width and length. So we're going to use the 0.5 width and the 2.5 length to sew this seam. And then you'll finish your seams if you need to. Some knits don't fray, so you may not need to finish the seam allowances. Just like this fabric here doesn't fray. Unless you really like a tidy finish, there's really no reason to finish the seam allowances unless they're fraying. All right, I'm going to pop over to the serger and sew this seam here. So I'm going to sew my sleeve to the bodice using my overlock or serger, and I'm going to use a 3/8 inch seam. And we're just sewing the sleeve to the armhole at this point. There we go. Have our sleeve cap there. Looking good. We'll press the seam toward the sleeve. It's time to sew our tie. I'm going to choose the long tie length. So both of my ties are going to be the same length and they're both going to be long. Refer to the instructions if you want to check out the different tie length options. Using a straight stitch and a 1/2 inch seam allowance, we're going to take one tie. We're going to fold it right sides together in half along its length. And we're going to sew across one short end and one long end. I'm going to use a straight stitch, 1/2 inch seam, and the stitch is going to be at 2.5 length. I have a couple of tips for sewing some of these long straight seams with knits, especially when you're doing something like a tie. If you can lessen the pressure of your presser foot here, and on my machine it's on the side here, so that this isn't pressing down so hard, that way both these layers will travel under the presser foot at the same rate of speed. Rather than if the pressure is too firm, what'll happen is the top layer won't move as fast as the bottom layer because the feed dogs are pulling that bottom layer. And then what happens is your layers will get a little misaligned and you'll get some torquing. So you'll want to make sure that if you can't adjust this pressure, that you're alleviating the pressure on the fabric occasionally by just lifting your presser foot up. And I like to put my needle down, lift the presser foot up, kind of shake it out a little bit, and pinning it along the way to make sure that you're staying on track, because these long narrow things, while they're really easy to sew, they can be a little fiddly with knits. So you just want to make sure you're managing it. And if you have a fabric that's just super difficult to use, maybe it's curling, you can try starching it. And I also like to wet my knits and then let them dry flat under a ruler, nice and flat, for a few days before I sew them. That way I know that they're not going to be curling when I get to them. So, and pulling on your fabric makes it curl, so make sure you're not pulling. All right, we'll trim this seam allowance down to half the width, and then we're going to turn it right side out. And you can clip your corners if you need to as well, and then we'll press them, and you're going to repeat for your other tie. All right, now I'll turn my corners and then I'll press this nice and flat. All right, so I have one of my ties done. Now I'm going to repeat for the other one. We're going to attach our ties to the bodice front here at this little seam that we left unsewn. So now if you're using two different tie lengths, you're going to want the longer one on the left front bodice, and that means left front as if you're wearing it. So right now we are looking at the left front bodice here, and we're going to line up the raw edge of the tie, and I'm going to put it seam down, so the seam here, and we're going to put this fold edge lined up to the seam right here where we attached our lining. And we're going to line up these raw edges, and there needs to be space right here so that we can attach our bodice to the skirt. So make sure you have at least 3/8 of an inch space for your seam here. And we're going to fold this lining over this edge here and line up all these edges. We're going to sew this seam 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter. Let's pin it in place here. You're going to see your seam allowance that we understitched on the lining side here, and that's correct. But you want to make sure that you're getting that tie right up there to the seam. Let me pull it apart and show you, because remember that we're about to sew right here. So we really want this tie to be all the way up there and the juncture to be right there, 3/8 of an inch from this raw edge here. This way, make sure that it's lined up right there. You can always baste it in place to make sure that it's going to end up there. So here we'll pin it like that. Now I'm going to pull this lining over, right sides together, make sure that thread is pointing toward the seam allowance. And now we can secure all these edges together. We're going to switch back to our 0.5 width and 2.5 length zigzag stitch. I'm going to reach in here, pull this pin out. There we go. We're going to trim this corner down a little bit to reduce some of the bulk. And now we're going to pull on this tie here and kind of pop out that corner. You can see we still didn't get that tie all the way right up there to the top edge. So it's going to probably happen like that. It's kind of hard to get those knits not to creep. So you can try again, you can baste it in place, and maybe you'll get a better result than I did. I'm fine with that though. Once it's all tied, when you tie this up, it's all gonna look really good. All right, now we're gonna repeat this for the other side. So now this would be the right front is the one you'd sew your shorter tie to if you were doing the two different tie lengths. Time to sew our side seams and our underarm seam of our sleeve, and we're gonna do each one a little differently from the other. So on the left front, which is what we're looking at here, you can see I have this inside out, and this is the left front as if I'm wearing it. We're going to sew from the waist seam here all the way up the side seam through the underarm and down the sleeve length. You can sew this with a zigzag or the serger or overlock, which is what I'm going to do. 3/8 inch seam allowance or 1 centimeter. And if you're using the zigzag, make sure to switch to the 0.5 width and the 2.5 length. Now for the other side, if you need finishing along your raw edges, you're going to finish those edges separately. We're going to sew this underarm seam a little bit differently so that we have an opening for our tie to go through right here at the waist. And it's going to be pretty easy to sew. So we're going to sew this one on this side from this notch here all the way up the side seam through the underarm and down the sleeve, just like the other side, but we're just going to start at this notch here and leave this open right here, and this is the right front as if you're wearing it. So let's go over to the serger. I'm going to sew one underarm, and then I'm going to finish these two edges separately, and then we'll sew this underarm seam on my zigzag. All right, so here we are on my left front. So here's my side seam, my underarm, and then here's my sleeve. And I'm going to sew this with the 3/8 inch seam, matching all the notches and seams. If you're finding it tricky to sew through this seam, you can offset the thickness. So one presses up and one presses down. And now for the right front, I'm going to finish these edges separately. And it might be a good idea to maybe mark out here on your fabric where this notch is so that you can see it after you finish this edge. Because my notch is cut away, I'll be able to see it pretty easily. I'm not going to trim anything off, I'm just going to overlock along the edge. And I'm going to serge this sleeve seam toward the sleeve. Now we'll do the other side. Now if you want to offset the seam allowance on the underarm because you know yours is particularly thick, now's the time to push that the other direction. There we go, we have the finished edge there, and I can still see my notch right there. So I'll know exactly where to start my seam. All right, so now we're going to sew this underarm seam on the zigzag machine. All right, so we're placing the side seam and the underarm right sides together on the right front. We're going to line up the seam where the sleeve is attached to the bodice here and all along the underarm here to the hem. And we're going to start this seam at this notch here. We're going to sew this at 3/8, and I'm going to use my zigzag stitch 0.5 width with the 2.5 length. Now we're also going to sew down here at the waist end, but just for 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch, just to define this opening. Because this right here, this edge here is our seam into our skirt. So the opening is going to end right there at the waist seam. So we're going to sew up from the waist for 3/8 of an inch, just a little bit there. And now we're going to press this seam open here. We're going to switch to a straight stitch. And with the 2.5 length, we're going to sew around this opening. Starting from the waist edge down here at the bottom, I'm going to go up along the opening and across the seam and back down to the waist. And I'm going to sew parallel to this opening using a 1/4 inch or a 6 millimeter seam and my straight stitch. Just keeping an eye on where that opening is. I'm going to sink my needle, lift up my presser foot, turn. Sew across the top. Again, sink my needle, lift the presser foot, turn, and then I'm going to go straight back down the bottom to the bottom. Just like that. And now we have an opening for our tie. And our bodice is ready to attach to our skirt. Look at that. Boop. Next, we're going to sew our cuffs. Don't forget to transfer this little marking right here. You're going to need that for your first seam. We're going to take the cuff and we're going to fold it in half like this, lining up all these angles here. And we're going to sew from this straight edge here down to the first little circle, and we're going to stop right there at that circle. We're using a straight stitch this time, 2.5 length. We'll flip it over and we'll do the same on this side. Make sure all this lays nice and flush. So now we're going to sew 2 more seams and we're going to pull this apart. So right here at this little mountain top here, we're going to pull this apart until the seams we just sewed line up to one another at the dots there. And we're going to sew the seam on each side, this one here and this one here. And we're going to have 4 seams all converging at that one point where those dots are. So what I like to do is kind of just focus on this one little area here, and I'm going to peek in here and sort of stack these two up, one on top of the other like that. So they're nice and lined up. So I'm stacking this little, that's where our seam ended on this side, and this is where our seam ended on this side, and we're just going to stack those two right on top of each other. And we're going to sew from this edge to that circle again. And you want to stop sewing before you get to your previous stitching. You're going to sew right up to it. It's going to look like a continuous seam. And now we're going to flip it over and do the same thing on this side. So again, I'm looking at that juncture there, and I'm stacking that up. And we're going to sew right up to it again. There we go. Now I'm going to trim this point a little bit right here, and this one right here. Those are the points on the seams we just sewed. And I'm going to reach in here inside the cuff. I'm just going to turn this point right side out, those two that I just clipped and sewed. So we're going to turn those right side out. And I'm going to do it on this other one too. This will just make it easier in the next step. All right, and now that first little seam right here, this little short one, we just want to line those up to each other, just like that. We're just kind of facing each other, and we're going to turn our whole cuff right side out. There we go. There's our cuff. So now we're going to pull this point out a little nicer, really gently, like that. And now we're going to take it to the iron, and we're going to press this really nicely. And I find that it's much easier to sort of lay this on the ironing board like this and lift this up, press this side, flip it over, press this side, and then you'll kind of have a really good like definition on these points, and you can kind of continue with the rest of the ironing. All right, so here we have our nice pressed cuff there, looking really good. And we're going to repeat all that for our second cuff. Once you have both of your cuffs sewn and pressed, you're also going to press along one edge 3/8 of an inch. So we're going to turn it to the inside, just like this, 3/8 of an inch all along this edge. You're going to do this on both of your cuffs. So now we're going to attach our cuffs to the sleeves. I've turned my cuff so that the pressed edge is on the inside, and I've turned my sleeve inside out. So we're going to slip the cuff into the sleeve, and we're going to line up the seam of the cuff to the notch on the sleeve. So right over here, we have our notch, and we're going to put the unpressed edge to the inside sleeve here. All right, and then we're going to pin it the rest all the way around. So I'm going to check my sleeve to see which is the back, and we're going to press the seam allowance toward the back. And I'm pinning from inside the cuff because we're going to sew with the inside of the cuff facing up. And I'll probably just push this other side of the cuff down in there so we make sure we don't accidentally catch it. And we're going to line up all these raw edges around the sleeve and the cuff. It should fit perfectly. All right, so now we're going to sew starting from inside the cuff like this, as opposed to if the sleeve were the other way, if it was right side out and we were sewing with it like this, all of this cuff under here has the danger of slipping under the needle. So this way we can see everything we're sewing, and the sewing seam is face up. So I'm going to start at the seam of the cuff here, which is lined up to that notch. And we'll sew this with a 3/8 inch seam, and we're going to use our zigzag stitch with the 0.5 width and the 2.5 length. Now I'm going to turn my sleeve the other direction, right side out. And now we're going to pin that pressed edge enclosing the seam. And I'm going to fold back my cuff just to make it a little easier to do this pinning part here. So I've kind of folded it all out like this. And we're going to press the seam toward the cuff like this. And use this folded edge to enclose our seam. There we go. All right, so now we have our folded edge just past our seam there. And I'm going to turn this back inside there. And we're going to slip this under the presser foot here. And we'll start right there at the seam. And we're going to stitch this down. And we'll just make sure that our little pressed edge there covers the seam here. And again, we have nothing under the presser foot and needle except what we're sewing. That's why we have the cuff above. All right, nice job. And now we're going to fold our cuff up. And we're going to pinch these two edges together. And we're going to sew a button on each side. All right, so we're just catching the cuff there. I'm going to position my button right there. So let's secure my tail. Secure my tail here. And we'll go through the other side. Grab our other button. And go back through to the other side, to the first button. All right, now we have our decorative cuff. So now we're going to repeat these steps for the other one. Time to start sewing our skirt. So first we're going to add the darts to the back skirt, and we're going to use our zigzag stitch that's 0.5 wide and 2.5 long. We're going to press the darts toward the center back, and then next we're going to sew our pockets. Grab your pockets, and now we're going to attach them to the back skirt first. We're going to place our pocket right sides together, and we're lining up the top edge of the pocket to the top edge of the skirt, just like this. And we have our side seam here. And we're going to sew this to the skirt using a 1/4 inch or a 6 millimeter seam. Now we're going to press the pocket away from the back skirt, like so. And we're going to press the seam toward the pocket. And now we're going to understitch the seam allowance to the pocket edge. So here's our pocket, here's our seam allowance, and we're going to press it toward the pocket and sew on the pocket through all 3 layers. And we're sewing about 3 millimeters or 1/8 of an inch away from the seam. Now we're going to repeat those same steps for each pocket and each side seam. So now this one here, this edge here is going to go to a front, and we're going to attach the other pocket to the other side of the back. So we're going to do this 3 more times. We have both of our pockets attached to both of our fronts and our backs now. So it's looking something like this. We have quite a large assembly. Here is one of my fronts here. And here is the center front edge, which we're going to finish soon. And then here is the side with the pocket attached to the back. You can see here's my back darts. And it goes around all the way. Now we have all of our skirts and pockets attached together. So now we're going to fold the pocket in half, right sides together, and we're going to stack our side seams. So we have this folded here with our pocket right sides together. Our side seam is stacked, and we have our side seam lined up as well. And we're going to sew this together starting at the bottom of the pocket, and we're going to go around the pocket and down the side seam. And if you need to finish your edges, you can do that at the same time so that you can put these 2 layers together. I'm going to use the overlock, and I'm going to sew the seam and finish the edges at the same time. But you can also just sew the seam and leave it raw if your edges don't fray, or you can sew the seam and finish the edges afterward. All right, so I've placed my pocket right sides together and lined up the side seam here, and we're going to sew from the pocket edge all along the bottom of it, over the side seam and down the side seam. Making sure that that side seam is stacked. It's always a little awkward at these little curves here. Just try and do it as smoothly as possible. And just keep an eye on where your knife is. We're going to sew from the waist down to this first notch here to define the pocket opening, and we're going to sew on the skirt parallel to this existing seam here, about 3/8 or 1 centimeter away from the seam. And we'll repeat for the other side. Once you've stitched from the waist to this first notch here, now we're going to push the pocket toward the front, and we're going to secure it to the waist at the top here, basting it in place. We're really getting close to having our Hazelton wrap dress. We're going to hem the center front skirt edge now. So I'm going to cover stitch. I've pressed back 3/8 of an inch along the center front skirt edge, and I'm going to cover stitch from the right side. Now you can zigzag this, you can use a twin needle, whatever method you choose to use. You have a 3/8 inch or 1 centimeter hem allowance along the center front edge. I'll repeat for my other front. There we go. Now we have our skirt ready to attach to the bodice. All right, we're ready to attach our bodice to the skirt. We're gonna have a dress. All right, we have our bodice here, and it's wrong side up. There's my back waist darts. Here's my side seams here. Here's my open one. And I have my skirt right side up. I'm gonna place these right sides together, lining up side seams, notches, center fronts. I'm going to press my side seams to the back or open, depending on which one it is. This one I'll press to the back. And I'm going to overlock my seam today, but you can use your zigzag stitch, and I would use the 0.5 width and the 2.5 length zigzag. Make sure your pockets are pressed forward. And we'll match darts to darts. I have my belt kind of folded up and pinned out of the way just to make sure I didn't catch it in any other seams. All right, here we go. We're using a 3/8 inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance. I'm going to start at one front and end at the other. If you really want to make sure these two edges line up, you could baste them together first. I think that's a great idea. Now the dress is going to be kind of heavy at this point, so try to keep it up onto your table so it's not pulling. You really don't want it to pull against the needle or be slipping off, and it is a little bit hard to wrangle when it's doing that. So just try and keep all of it on top of your table or your work surface and adjust so that it can feed nicely. One final step before we can wear our Hazelton dress, we're going to hem the bottom. And again, I'm going to use a cover stitch. So I've pressed it up 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters. And I've pinned it in a few places since my fabric is starting to curl a little bit. So I kind of wanted to make sure it stays pressed up. And I'm going to stitch it from the right side. And you can also twin needle this or zigzag it like I mentioned on the front hem here. Okay, and now I'll probably take this tail and bend it back and kind of secure it in the seam allowance here of my hem. That way it secures the tail. I could also loop it inside here with a needle and sort of thread it through the stitches. When I have some of these serged edges that meet some of my finished edges, I like to tidy them up a little bit. So I'm going to take this little tail here, and because we press the seam down towards the skirt, I'm going to hide it under this seam here, right here. So we're just going to pull on this, get it nice and snug. It's a little bit of a tangle right now. So we can trim it, loosen it up a little bit. And now I'm going to pull this pretty firmly into the seam allowance here, like this. And because we've been using a lot of zigzag today, we'll just stick with the zigzag. It'll probably help encase those loose threads even better. So I put it at about a 3 width and a 2.5 length. And we'll just go over those tails in the seam allowance there that we've pulled to the underside. And now I'm going to trim all my threads like that. And so there's my tail like that. And that looks pretty good. All right, so now let's check her out. The Hazelton wrap dress is part of the Cashmerette Club membership program. You can learn more about Cashmerette Club by checking the link in the description. Thanks so much for sewing with me today. I hope you enjoy your new Hazelton wrap dress. I know I will.